Hello everyone, Bendy Bono here, recording this video for the second time. I don't know what happened the first time, the sound or something got kind of messed up. So we'll see if that happens again this time. If it does, and something weird happens, you might get an audio only version for all or part of this video. Something weird happens because I have my handy dandy microphone over here going into the other computer. So at least you will get the audio portion of this. Got to get the boom mic out of the shot, right? That's cinematography 101. Not cinema. I don't know what I'm talking about. Never mind. I don't have a ton of time also to record this. We're going to go kind of lightning round through this. I apologize for that, but you know, I've been podcasting, doing YouTube stuff for 4 years now, and it sucks having to re-record. You never have the same amount of enthusiasm, so I apologize for that. For all two of you who watch these, but hey, you know, it's worth doing something that's worth doing well, and I will do as well as I can in the 10 minutes that I have. All right. Question 22, the providence of God. You can read the articles for yourself. I'm not going to waste time by going reading them because, well, like I said, we have limited time. Can providence be suitably attributed to God? Oh my goodness, I already have everything expanded from when I did this video the first time. Okay, objections. Providence is part of prudence. Prudence cannot belong to God because he never needs prudent counsel. Providence is not eternal. It concerns temporal things. Providence is composite since it involves the intellect and the will, hence this overarching section right there. So that would roll down from God. Okay, but argument from authority. Scripture is going to say in the Book of Wisdom that God governs all by his providence. Anything good in things is created by God. It is part of the goodness of things for them to be ordered towards an end. To be ordered towards an end is what we call providence. So that might not be your dictionary definition of providence, but it is Thomas Aquinas' definition of providence. Since this is provided to them, this being ordered towards an end by God, God has providence because he's providing providence to his creatures. Nevertheless, God doesn't have providence as though he himself was ordered towards an end, but only as he orders others. An important distinction. All right, replies to the objections. It is not fitting for God to receive counsel, but it is for him to give it. So that objection is kind of silly. Number two, there are two parts of providence: the reason of order and the execution of the order. In other words, coming up with what you want the end to be for something, and then the actual ordering of that end, carrying out the order. The former is eternal and exists in God, while the execution of the order is temporal and exists in time. And then number three, providence resides mainly in the intellect, but even if that wasn't the case, we talk about the will and the intellect. Those are the same in God, so it doesn't create a composite in him, and that would apply to everything we talk about in questions 22 through 24 under this subheading of things that pertain to the will and the intellect. All right, Article 2, whether everything is subject to the providence of God. You know what? I don't know. I'm not going to bother to unexpand and then re-expand. We'll just roll with it for today. I apologize. I like to do better than that with these videos, but it is what it is. Okay, objections. If everything was subject to God's providence, nothing would happen by chance. That's incorrect. And then there's the problem of evil. God's providence would exclude defect and evil. Evil exists. Therefore, God's providence doesn't reach everything. Whatever happens necessarily is not subject to providence, and many things happen from necessity, and anything left to itself is not subject to providence. Scriptures speak of man being left to himself, and then Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 9:9 that God does not care for the oxen. Actually, that's a slight misquoting of Paul that our objector is making, and Aquinas will correct him shortly. This can be extended to other irrational creatures. But Book of Wisdom again says God's providence extends to all. So there you go. All right, the argument. Every agent acts towards an end so far as the effect of its first agent extends. Oh, second time I'm doing this, I still got typos. What a mess. God is the first cause of all, and his effects extend to all. So, okay, what this is saying is that if I order providence for something, like for my kids or whatever, my providence extends as far as my effects as their father extend, which, you know, they're young right now, so that's pretty far. Then as they get older, you know, the extent of my providence in their lives shrinks until they're adults and living on their own and all that good stuff. Unless they're 30 living in my basement, but we'll hope we don't wind up in that case. Anyway, but in the case of God, there's no limit to his extent, so by definition, his providence must extend to everything. Okay. Reply to the objections. In particular cases, one can escape providence, but in universal cases, one cannot. That's what seems like chance to us is foreseen by God. That's essentially restating the argument. In the example I gave with my kids, I would be a particular cause. They have the ability and will escape my providence to various degrees as they grow up. But God is a universal cause, and no one can escape his providence. All right, corruptions and defects are contrary to particular causes, but not to God's universal cause. Why? Because God will providentially bring good out of every evil. The problem of evil stuff we've talked about before. Number 3, human providence does not extend to necessity, but divine providence does. Man being left to himself does not mean that he is outside of God's providence, but that under God's providence, man has free will. Very important distinction. Man, in Aquinas' system, God's providence and God's will are not at odds with human free will. Rather, human free will exists as a part of God's will. Very important distinction. And finally, rational creatures are under God's providence in a special way, but this does not mean irrational creatures are wholly outside of it. So take comfort, oxen. You're not completely cut off from God's providence. All right. Does God have immediate providence over everything? It belongs to the dignity of a ruler to act through intermediaries. All dignity belongs to God. Therefore, his providence acts through intermediaries. What that's saying is that if you're a king and you decide it's time to collect taxes, the king doesn't knock on your door and collect the taxes himself. He sends a tax man to do it. Why? It's part of his dignity as a king to not have to do that. Although maybe we'd have fewer taxes if our legislators had to go collect them themselves. But that's a whole different discussion. Anyway, number 2, if God has immediate providence over everything, that seems to do away with all secondary causes. And then Augustine says it's better to be ignorant of bad things, vile things. Whatever is best is assigned to God. Therefore, God does not have immediate providence over vile things. All right, but both Scripture and St. Gregory affirm God's immediate providence over everything. Okay? And then, as Aquinas does so often, we're going to draw a distinction between types of providence. So there's 2 types of providence. There's the ordaining of something to an end and the execution of that order. In the first case, God's providence is immediate over everything. That was something we touched on in Article 1 in response to that objection of, providence being temporal, but God being eternal. And so Aquinas has kind of already made this distinction. In the first case, God's providence is immediate over everything. In the second case, God works through intermediaries. This is done to impart the dignity of causality to rational creatures. So you and I, as part of our free will, have the dignity of causality. We get to be part of the execution of God's order, even though he has immediate providence over everything through his ordaining that providence. Okay? Objections answer. Reply to 1 is part of a king's dignity to act through intermediaries, and God does the same thing through us, by giving us the dignity of causality. But in the first case, he has a perfect providence over everything. The king doesn't have that, but that's not due to dignity. That's due to a defect that a king is not omniscient over his kingdom. Okay. Secondary causes are still present due to the second type of providence, where we have the dignity of causality. Great phrase. And then number 3, it is better for us not to know vile things because we're corruptible. That's not the case with God. All right. We're going to make it. Whether providence imposes any necessity on things foreseen. Number 1, the divine providence is eternal and cannot be frustrated. Therefore, it imposes necessity on things. Providence ought to make its work as stable as possible. Since God is all-powerful, this means he must impose necessity on things. And then Boethius speaks of fate flowing from providence. But Dionysius says that divine providence doesn't corrupt nature. Some nature is corrupted. Therefore, divine providence does not impose necessity on everything. Okay? Very similar argument to what we've seen when we talked about the will of God, that some things are absolute and some things are conditional, right? Some things are forced to be necessary under divine providence. Some things are allowed to be contingent, especially as secondary providence. Though, causality. Holy crap, there's the bell for dinner time. All right, so I got to wrap this up. Divine providence allows for secondary causes and contingency. Okay, let's very quickly go through these objections. Divine providence includes things happening by contingency. Therefore, when something happens by contingency, that's not frustrating the divine providence, it's fulfilling it, because God, in his providence, wills that something happens by contingency, that free will be involved. Number two, so long as things happen in line with how they are foreseen, the divine providence is stable. Very similar answer to number one. Boethius is speaking of God's providence as it pertains to necessary things, but not to contingent things. All right, sorry, not the best video, but we got through question 22. Apologize for that. I will come back in better form for question 23, predestination. We'll cover that in two parts because it's 8 articles. I got to go eat dinner because the wife is calling me. All right, I will talk to you later. Goodbye.